You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the biohealth capital region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in biohealth.
Hi, this is Rich Bendis, your host for BioTalk. And I'm really excited today because one of the most talked about technologies in the world for many, many decades is what is artificial intelligence and quantum computing, machine learning, and all of these things that you're hearing about today, which you can't turn on the news without people talking about the positives of AI and sometimes the negatives of what's going on with AI. But we're very privileged today to have one of the leading experts in the United States in the AI area as it relates to the biohealth industry. And fortunately, he's one of the Biohealth Innovation Board members, and it's Jürgen Klenk, who is a principal with Deloitte, and he's the precision medicine leader for federal health with Deloitte. And we have the pleasure of him giving a tutorial to us today, plus I get a chance to ask him some questions. So Jürgen, welcome to BioTalk.
Thanks, Rich. Glad to be here. Excited to talk a little bit about AI.
Yeah, we're excited to hear this because I just had an internal staff meeting last Friday and it was on general topics, but the whole thing devolved into a discussion about AI, of which I am not an expert. So that I've learned the next time we have a staff meeting, they want to talk about AI, I'm going to have you join me. Is that okay, Jürgen?
That sounds good. I'm excited about that.
Okay, I can't wait. I'm sure that they can't wait either. I did a brief introduction of you, but didn't get into details about your background. And I think it would be great if you did a little introduction of yourself for our listeners. And you can go back as far as you would like and talk about how you evolved into your current role at Deloitte today.
So as you can undoubtedly hear from my accent, I didn't grow up here. I actually grew up in Germany, went to school there, and also sometime in the US and Australia. I got a PhD in mathematics, and during my studies, I started working in AI, specifically in neural networks. That was in the early 90s. And then out of grad school, I joined IBM Zurich Research Lab. That was in the mid 90s to work on novel, not natural language processing or NLP technologies. And what we tried to do there was build a Siri or an Alexa that could respond to questions. That was before we had smartphones. Then after that, I did move to Munich to run a bioinformatics startup that was in the early 2000s. And I started applying AI methods to pharmaceutical research. So we developed algorithms to automatically analyze images obtained from cancer research programs during drug discovery. And that was my first step into the biomedical field. Then I came to the US to work in government consulting in early 2006. And I've supported the NIH, CDC, FDA, and a few other government agencies ever since, also with some interim commercial pharma and healthcare engagements. And as you said, I'm a principal today at Deloitte. I lead work on AI and data in federal health, and I'm really pleased to be doing that work and seeing it, how far it's come over the years and decades.
Well, that's a great background for this introduction to AI, Jürgen, and congrats on your career. You just happened to be in the right place at the right time based on your background and your expertise.
Yeah, that's almost a dream come true in many ways, because we've all talked about this whole field of AI, where it came from. As I mentioned, I've worked in AI now for over 30 years. This was during a time that we kind of called the AI dark ages. And this was because it was unclear at that time if and when AI would become relevant, or when work was viewed as scalable for the mainstream market. It wasn't at the time. So my interests really revolves mostly around using AI to capture and use biomedical knowledge now, and then perform some ever more complex tasks that help advance biomedical research. And I think with what happened recently with the ChatGPTs and the likes, we crossed this threshold that brought AI into the mainstream. And so people are now beginning to imagine things. For instance, could they see AI design new drugs? And that's exciting to see. As I said, it's a dream come true that was very long in the making.
When we were talking about doing this BioTalk podcast, you said to me, do you want a title for this? And I said, sure. What would your title be? and you said, how about AI reality versus hype in the biohealth industry? And I said, oh, that is perfect, Jurgen. So we're going to try to take AI out of the dark ages, as you say, shine some light on it today. And maybe one of the best places to start is a little historical review of where this hype came from and how we managed to get to the hype cycle that we're in right now.
Yeah, sure. So maybe it's just a brief history. So AI dates back to the 1950s. The term first was coined at a conference at Dartmouth College. So the field is just about 70 years old now. And then through those decades, progress was fairly steady. And there were some notable events that probably people would have heard about and generated some public attention. For example, when AI first beat the world chess champion or won Jeopardy. But it was really those little token things that happened then that didn't apply to the broader mainstream market just yet. But then things changed over the past few years, and there were some notable ingredients or key ingredients, I would say, that sort of propelled the field at the forefront of everyone's attention over those past few years. And the first is really the available compute power that we now have. So specifically, those latest graphical processing units or GPUs, that compute power has reached a dimension that allows us to process the compute intense machine learning models that underlie AI systems in real time. And the second ingredient is the volume of available data that represents our world's knowledge, which has grown exponentially and really reached a capacity now that has moved us beyond the previous toy models that we had. And then the third ingredient is what's called transformer models. This is something I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later on, I hope. It forms the foundation for tools such as ChatGPT or Bard. And it has allowed us to quickly process these large data volumes and build systems that can use that knowledge in real time to respond to many different challenges. And it's those three ingredients, compute power, data, transformer models, that have helped AI cross the chasm to bring it into the mainstream today. So I'm sure that everyone who is listening to this conversation has used tools such as ChatGPT or Bard by this time. So you would have seen what they're capable of. And it has really opened up our eyes and made us imagine what a future could be if we harness that power of generative AI, or Gen AI for short. And really by doing so, it has dragged AI into that spotlight that it is today.
Thank you for that history, but you're making an assumption a lot of our listeners are using these tools. I have never used any of them, but I'm an old fart, so it takes me a little longer to get into this world, Jurgen. But
next time I see you, we got to sit down in person and turn ChatGPT on.
Well, we can actually do it by Zoom too. So I'm going to follow up with it. You mentioned ChatGPT, and this is probably not something that you wanted to go as much into detail on, but that's something that I hear a lot, that we're all hearing about ChatGPT. And if you don't mind, and this is maybe something you didn't want to elaborate on too much, just give a little brief description of how ChatGPT evolved, who created it, can we trust it right now? We're going to get into that later in this podcast, but just give a little brief intro to ChatGPT.
Yeah, sure. So it was a company called OpenAI that was founded that ultimately created ChatGPT, or the GPT large language models that sit underneath it. And basically, they put it into this interface that you could enter a query, a prompt, to make it respond to your query. What it does ultimately is it generates words, one word after another, and it basically uses a knowledge base in the background. That's what the language model is trained on, to find what the most appropriate word in the sequence is, one after the other. In this way, it creates or generates, hence the word generative AI, it generates a response to your query. And so you can ask it questions. You mentioned quantum computing. You could ask it, what is quantum computing? And it will come back with a really good answer to that, and may even give you could ask it for references about it, and it would give you some. And so it's really a very powerful tool that uses a very broad knowledge base. Hence that, as I mentioned, this large data volume that we have that sits behind these large language models now, that allows you to have a very comprehensive answer. Now, can you trust it? We'll touch on that in a little bit, I would say. The answers are often very good and very believable, not always true. I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Great. Thank you for that intro to ChatGPT. But now that we just talked about that a little bit, let's go a little bit more into some of the examples that illustrate the value and the benefits and the impact that AI can have for you.
Sure. So as I mentioned, ChatGPT or Bard is another system like that. We are seeing these Gen AI systems being used mostly for administrative tasks these days. So for example, if you have a large collection of documents, you could ask a Gen AI tool to write you an executive summary, and it would be really good at doing that. You could also use it to automate some of the tedious tasks, office tasks. For example, could be used to review grant applications, policies, or other documents and capture the essence in them and show you the salient points out of those. However, this generative AI technology cannot just generate text. You can generate other modalities. So you could use it to generate images. You could now ask such a tool to create you an illustration of, let's say, your favorite character in a movie or some other artistic creation. It would create you an image of that. So these are really just examples. You could also generate movies or audio files. And it doesn't even stop there. People are now beginning to think, what if Gen AI could create molecules designed to treat particular diseases? What if they could create treatment plans for patients? And this is becoming very real very quickly. So we're seeing all these different things that Gen AI could generate that could become very interesting for the biomedical field as well.
And when you say this is becoming very real very quickly, and we're talking about really the biomedical, biohealth industry, are there early adopters of AI that you're seeing within the biohealth industry that are sort of the leaders in incorporating AI into their everyday work?
We do see papers appear. Those are papers that we see pharmaceutical companies or even, let's say, the NIH doing some initial research around the technologies. And so they're experimenting with it right now. We see some initial results of what could become a very interesting field, but it is still truly very early stage experimental, that all the things that we see at the moment.
Let's talk about some of the underlying key technologies. And then you keep mentioning about Gen AI. I don't think we've described what Gen AI is. I assume I know what it is, but I'm going to let you define Gen AI because you're going to continue to use that term as well.
Sure. So the hype that we have currently is really caused by Gen AI. Gen AI is generative AI. It's a subfield of AI. And the specifics around Gen AI is that it basically generates content. Again, this could be text, it could be images, it could be anything that you can generate. So it has several key underlying technologies. Well, first of all, you need compute power. So underlying hardware, these are typically provided and widely available from cloud service providers, Google Cloud, Amazon Web Services, or Microsoft Azure. That's where these Gen AI models run. So the second ingredient are large language models, or LLMs. And that's what we call the trained transformer models. They are essentially trained on a body of knowledge, and you can determine what that body of knowledge actually is. So if you're interested in biomedicine, you would use an LLM that is trained on biomedical and clinical knowledge. And finding the right LLM for your use case is mostly the most critical thing, because there are literally thousands of them available today. Many of them are open source, and some are proprietary. The third ingredient is a user interface to interact with the large language model. This is typically in the form of a prompt to which the large language model will respond. And then finding good prompts that allow the LLM to generate the answer you're looking for has become its own discipline, which we call prompt engineering. As you might imagine, it really depends on the modality in which the LLM generates a response. So whether it's a text response, an image or video, or perhaps at some point even the molecule. And then lastly, you have to have some environments in which you can easily and quickly experiment with these technologies. You should think of that as your sandbox that's pre-configured with a wide array of available LLMs that you can then customize and test out. And then mechanisms to support you in engineering and testing prompts so that you can produce good answers, and then be able to quickly package your results into an easily deployable application that can be used by your target users. Deloitte, we offer such an environment that sits on top of the cloud service provider's infrastructure. And we're seeing really how it's beginning to make a difference at agencies such as the NIH.
Thank you for that. I mean, when you're talking about these new key technologies, there's generally some challenges and risks associated with them, Jürgen. So let's talk a little bit about some of these challenges and risks associated with these key technologies, which you just described.
Yeah, and we touched on this a little bit earlier when we spoke about Open or ChatGPT can do and what it can generate. So some specific risks I'm going to go into are associated with GenAI, such as that it could be used by bad actors to generate fakes. It could generate fake stories, fake images, fake videos. And you could do that at scale because it generates that material very quickly. This is why we see now some organizations offer watermarks that allow you to verify if something was indeed created by GenAI or a human. And then the governments are also stepping in and beginning to regulate the technology precisely for this risk. So, for example, President Biden issued the executive order on AI on October 30th this year, which identifies 8 principles through which the administration requires and also incentivizes certain changes related to AI's development and use. That's including AI safety and security, innovation, competition, and equity and civil rights. Now, to give you a sense for the scale of risks, you'd really have to think on the scale of atomic fission, which, as we know, has many benefits, but also poses severe threats to humanity if it gets in the hands of bad actors. It's that scale that people think AI or Gen AI is at this point in time, or has the potential to be at. So we really need to be mindful of the risks and threats. Another risk I just want to quickly touch on is trustworthiness. And that's what I mentioned earlier when we talked about the Gen AI generating text. It really has the ability to generate very good text, but sometimes it has a tendency to hallucinate. So it makes up facts that are entirely plausible and could be true, but they're not. And it's your responsibility to check if a response from the Gen AI system is indeed true and can be trusted, or if it's a hallucination. And then lastly, more an operational risk. If you run these large language models, that could become very costly because they're so compute intense. So if your organization allows your team to use large language models, you might end up running up a significant bill for all those compute cycles that the models consume if you don't put good cost control measures in place.
One of the interesting things you talked about related to the risk and challenges, you mentioned governments are beginning to regulate the technology, but at the same time, we know the United States government has been very good about funding early stage innovation and technologies that are extremely high risk before industry would get engaged in taking this upon themselves. And examples might be biotechnology or nanotechnology, which are enabling technologies similar to AI. Do you see that there's a role other than regulation, for example, the U.S. federal government, to play in the innovation of AI?
Yes, there definitely is. The technology in and of itself has been largely driven already by the startup environment. OpenAI that generated ChatGPT was founded just last decade, and so it's a fairly young enterprise as well. So the tech startup industry has played a dominant role in this. And if we see a transition into the biomedical field, I would say equally that funding some of those early applications of Gen AI in the biomedical field to seed the research is going to be critical to push it into the right direction. And those are programs that I think will be immensely important to ensure the correct and ethical use of those resources also for biomedical research.
I would imagine it could be a very useful tool, for example, for NIH, because even though they've got about a $48 billion budget, some of that's intramural, some of it's extramural, they almost have to make decisions on where to place the bets because Congress now has great expectations about what is coming out of all of these research dollars and what really can be commercialized to really benefit human health and the general population. Do you see this tool potentially just for NIH in the future, helping them in their decision making as to where to place their investment bets for the future.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And if you think about how NIH operates, they have a budget, but it is not endless, and they need to be good stewards of their money. So the process of, for example, grant reviews is a very complicated and very labor intense process. And it basically is the foundation for how NIH steers large parts of its extramural funding, and helping streamline and automate some of those processes can help NIH be faster, be more nimble, and be able to do the work with a lot less human effort, and therefore also saving money in the process that they can make available elsewhere.
I think there's a great deal of frustration of a lot of small companies we work with, Jürgen, and we're talking with Jürgen Klink. And Jürgen basically is a principal with Deloitte and precision medicine leader for federal health, but more importantly, one of the AI leaders within Deloitte. And the small businesses we work with who apply for small business innovation research grants, which is not a small program, it's about $1.5 billion with NIH. Sometimes it might take upwards of 6 to 9 months before they get initial feedback on the proposal they submitted. And then it might take another 3 months to 6 months before the NIH makes a decision to award. I would think that potentially AI, and you talk about streamlining processes and decision-making, AI might be a tool, not the only decision maker, but could be factored into some of these processes to speed this up. Because if you're looking at innovative technologies and it takes a year to make a decision, by the time they make that decision, sometimes the innovation has dwindled or has been lost. Do you see this as a potential application in the future, Jürgen?
Absolutely, Rich. And this is what we actually started to work on with NIH even. We're beginning to look at how the grants review process could be streamlined and updated and automated, or semi-automated at least, to accelerate the timelines that they have. If you imagine, it's a totally manual process at the moment, and doing these reviews is taking them a long time because people have to read through those lengthy applications and then compare them with other applications, and the volume that they're getting is large in terms of such applications. So clearly the timelines that you laid out could be dramatically accelerated if you begin to semi-automate those processes that underlie the grant review.
Great, thank you. We know some practical applications of AI. So let's talk about the outlook for the future. And we're talking about the hype versus reality. Do you think this hype's going to continue? And what can we expect over the next coming months and years, perhaps even for the rest of this decade, with what's going to evolve with AI?
Yeah, I think that we'll see a very quick adoption of some basic applications of Gen AI into the mainstream. For example, such as that grants review process or other processes that can be automated or semi-automated. This is already happening now, and it will drive the utility of this technology very quickly. How much Gen AI will then affect biomedical research remains to be seen. My estimate is that before this decade is out, we will see new drugs designed by AI, and we'll see similar advances in other industries. So the hype will continue.
So what organizations can and should do at this point, because it really doesn't fit into the traditional IT department by itself. It involves many different disciplines within a industry or a organization. And what should companies do, whether they be small or large, to evaluate how they can become a part of this AI wave? And should they become a part of this AI wave?
I think there's no denying that this wave is real. Organizations need to get on board with it at this point. So you can begin by setting up environments for your staff to start exploring the technology and see how it can benefit you or your organization. Another important aspect would be to really make sure your staff gets trained so that they're prepared for what's to come and can use the technology, and also understand and discuss and review the risks that it has so you can mitigate them correctly. So it's really important that organizations do this right away. And there are lots of people in organizations that actually have an affinity with this technology. And so taking advantage of their skills is also going to be important. Now, as is often the case, I think innovation here too will come from startups. So if you're an entrepreneur or investor, you may want to start thinking about how your industry could be disrupted by this technology and identify ways to participate in this disruption. Because the disruption itself will be huge. Experts expect it to be the next industrial revolution, perhaps even bigger than the PC or mobile computing. So it's really disrupt or prepare to be disrupted.
You mentioned investments. And again, when we talk about SBIRs and federal grants and investments, as I talk to my entrepreneurs and residents of BioHealth Innovation, which give business and commercialization advice to companies throughout the country, they're saying that AI is being incorporated into almost all of the proposals today that people are submitting for funding. So how do you separate out those that are just incorporating AI because they know that it's very fashionable to incorporate AI into your strategies for your company versus those that actually are really going to implement AI into what they are proposing they need investments for?
I mean, on the one hand, we see a lot of buzzwords just being used in the proposals, as you say. And those buzzwords are basically to generate hopefully good scores on the proposals that people are making. For us, what we do is we are experimenting with the technology. You can tell if somebody just talks about it, and this is basically almost text that they clipped from some Wikipedia or so, or if somebody truly has gotten their hands dirty in the technology and knows what they're talking about and can explain how it can be implemented or utilized. That difference is noticeable. And I think if you're to review a proposal, you have to pay attention to those nuances. If you're an organization, I would really, that's why I said, get involved in it now, get on board with it now, put up your own sandbox, start playing it, and let your people get their hands dirty a little bit in the technology so that you can start understanding its values and benefits and understand how to use it.
I have a couple follow-ups on that. So we're probably going to need an AI tool to look to see whether the AI that is being incorporated in some of these proposals is real or if it's basically people just, as you say, using buzzwords. So it's basically how do you use AI to discern the reality of people who actually know how to implement it and incorporate it versus those that are just talking about the hype that's associated around AI. And is that something that's easy to discern, Jürgen?
Well, I will take it one step further and say there are people who are starting to use Gen AI to write proposals automatically. So you can basically use the technology to start writing your proposal or let it write your proposals. And we've experimented with that just to see what it would do. And it gets you a good way along the path of writing something. But of course, the details oftentimes are lacking still a little bit. So you can think about it perhaps as let's work together, human and machine here, to put something together that's really meaningful and useful and bring both ideas generated by the machine together with the ideas generated by humans and write something really good. The government has also said that they may have to experiment with reviewing proposals using Gen AI technologies. And that's the same with grant applications, of course. And that we will probably see a time that technology is so pervasive that it's going to be used across many different domains in many different ways. So the particular grant or proposal writing process is probably just one area where it will make a difference very soon. But it is still important to distinguish between, is the organization then submitting such a proposal truly capable of delivering on the work? Did they just have somebody, some machine write something, but then they're not able to follow through?
One of the other things you talked about, what organizations can do, is that train your staff. If you don't have an internal expert on your staff that understands AI and all of its implications, how do you go about choosing and selecting the right person that can be a consultant or educate your team on AI? And how do you validate that they really know what they're talking about and can provide the tutorial that's necessary for your team?
In our case, it's basically a trusted network. So we have some retired partners at Deloitte, for example, that have formed a firm called AI Leaders that we're working with. So if you have direct relationships with individuals or In this case, they formed a small organization to basically do just that, train people. Then, that's a good way to make sure that you get meaningful training programs together. In our case, the other part that was important for us was also to put training programs together that address people at the right levels at which they are. So we have to train all of our executives, all of our leaders, no matter what their backgrounds are. They may not have ever written a single line of code or done anything in terms of data science, but they still have to interact with this technology. They have to learn to interact with this technology. And so giving the executive leadership at all levels in all areas some level of understanding of what the technology is and how to use it is incredibly important for business decision making and for the right application of the technology and understanding its risks and challenges. So develop the right training programs at the appropriate staff levels, from junior all the way to the executive level, and make sure that you find your trusted advisors that help you with putting that together.
Well, I would assume that before you can go out and advise other people, you have to do it internally at Deloitte, and that's something you guys have been working on. And I would imagine you're probably intimately involved in that training process within Deloitte. Is that correct, Jürgen?
That is correct. Yeah, we just ran through our entire federal health leadership team, ran them through a full day, 2-day training program where they could ultimately learn all the details about generative AI. And then we followed up with, okay, now let's discuss applications of that. What does that mean for the type of business that you're leading? So we went through case studies to give people hands-on views and ideas how to think about technology and how to apply it correctly. So yes, training happens, and we just ran through that with our entire leadership team.
I'm sure we could talk all day about other things related to AI in this world that we're evolving into. But if you had to close this today, and I'm sure we'll do a follow-up about other areas that as AI progresses, are there any other things that we haven't covered you'd like to leave with our listeners on BioTalk today, Jürgen?
I think it is here to stay. What I think I'd like to explore more at some point is how can it really benefit the biomedical research field directly, not just for more administrative work, but truly on the scientific side also. I think that is worth a deeper conversation at some point, because that's going to be of interest to a lot of the companies that I know you're working with. And there's going to be a lot of innovation that's possible and could come out of it that has tremendous potential that is worth exploring.
I think that's a great point. And I've had some preliminary discussion about whether it's a webinar or a training session, or how do you get some people in the biomedical field to talk with people who are the application experts like yourself and Deloitte to come together and talk about this utilization from a scientific stand rather than from just a back office administrative side. And that's something we can use as a follow-up item. But I've really enjoyed this today, and we've had this edition of BioTalk with Jürgen Klink, a BioHealth Innovation Board member. Thank you for serving. Who's a principal with Deloitte. He's a precision medicine leader for federal health on a national basis and has become one of the leading AI experts in the field. So, Jürgen, thank you for joining us on BioTalk today, and we're certainly going to follow up with a number of those action items we talked to you about.
Rich, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.